Welcome. You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
If you're someone who is fascinated by criminal history, or if you just love those weird moments where, unstoppable human ingenuity collides with supposedly immovable objects.
Oh, you are absolutely going to love the story we've got in front of us today. It's wild.
It really is. But to start, I want to set a very specific scene for you. I want you to imagine just for a second that you're taking a casual stroll down East King Street in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Right. Just a normal, everyday walk.
Exactly. You're walking past normal buildings. You're maybe looking for a place to grab a cup of coffee, checking your phone, and then suddenly you look up and find yourself face to face with an actual terrifying 18th century Norman castle.
It's a genuinely shocking piece of architecture to just, encounter in the middle of a modern American street grid.
Shocking is almost an understatement. I mean, I'm talking about a massive, imposing stone fortress. It has these 18-inch thick walls, heavy iron grates, and towering, intimidating stone structures.
Yeah, stuff that looks like it belongs in medieval Europe, guarding some tyrannical king.
Right. It does not look like it belongs next to a modern intersection.
Huh.
But you aren't looking at some quirky billionaire's estate or an abandoned movie set. You are looking at the historic Lancaster County Prison.
Which is an institution with a history that's just as dark, complex, and, bizarre as its facade suggests.
Exactly. And so that's our mission for this deep dive. We've got a massive stack of historical sources, architectural blueprints, and local newspaper archives.
And we're going to unpack the 250-year evolution of the Lancaster County Prison.
But more importantly, we are going to dissect the two most legendary, cinematic, and frankly, unbelievable prison breaks in the entire history of the county.
Right. Two escapes that, if you look at them purely chronologically, they shouldn't share any DNA whatsoever.
No, not at all.
I mean, they happened nearly 90 years apart. One took place in the horse and buggy era of 1883, and the other occurred in the modern helicopter-patrolled, radio-dispatched era of 1971.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because here is the detail that absolutely blew my mind when we were first going through these sources.
Yeah.
In both of these massive jailbreaks, despite nearly a full century of technological advancement between them, exactly 12 men managed to slip through the cracks of this imposing stone fortress. And the 1883 mastermind, the guy who beat a medieval castle, he orchestrated his mass breakout using a pet canary.
It is, without a doubt, one of the most brilliant, biologically creative, tactical exploits in the history of the American penal system.
It's crazy.
It really is. But to truly understand how 24 men managed to beat this specific fortress across two completely different centuries, we have to start with the building itself.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We need to look at how this formidable structure came to be and why the county commissioners in the 1800s decided to build something that looked like it was designed to repel a siege army.
Right. Because before it was a Game of Thrones castle, it was basically just a really sturdy shed.
Yeah, quite literally.
Yeah. The whole concept of incarceration in Lancaster had incredibly humble, almost improvised beginnings. Like, if we trace the origins all the way back to 1729, the very first jail wasn't even its own dedicated campus.
No, it was ordered to be built in a place called John Postlethwaite's Tavern.
Which tells you a lot about the colonial justice system right there.
Yeah.
The tavern was the center of public life, so naturally that's where you put the jail.
Exactly. It was built as a simple, strong log house on the land of the county sheriff, a guy named Robert Barber, over in Wright's Ferry.
Which we now know as Columbia, Pennsylvania.
Right. And it was designated as the common jail of the county. And when we say strong log house, we're talking about raw, hand-hewn timber.
Yeah, it wasn't a place you served a 20-year sentence.
Not at all. In 1729, a jail was essentially a holding pen. You put someone there to make sure they didn't run away before the judge arrived in town or, before they paid their debts.
Because the penal philosophy at the time wasn't about long-term rehabilitation or even long-term warehousing, right?
Exactly. Punishments were swift, often physical and public. Fines, the stocks, public whipping or execution. The log cabin just needed to hold you for a few weeks.
But as the population of Lancaster grew, that model became entirely unsustainable. A log cabin simply cannot hold determined individuals as the sheer volume of crime scales up with a growing town.
So the cabin holds the line for a few decades, but by the summer of 1774, the local government realizes they are severely outgunned.
They need a major upgrade.
Right. So they start construction on a solid stone jail right in the actual city of Lancaster at the corner of West King and North Prince Streets.
And they finish it in 1775, which is wild timing because the Revolutionary War is literally just kicking off.
It is. And that 1775 stone jail functions for a while, but it quickly falls victim to the same exact problem: population growth and shifting ideas about crime.
Right, because by the 1820s, the concept of the penitentiary is starting to take root in America, right? The idea that criminals should be isolated to reflect on their sins and do penance.
Yes, and that requires space. It requires individual cells.
And this leads to a detail I absolutely love because it shows that local government budget debates have literally never changed in 200 years.
Oh, human nature never changes.
Right. So we have sources showing that by 1827, citizens are writing letters complaining that the jail is overcrowded and insecure. A committee is formed to look into it. Years pass.
As they do.
Finally, in 1831, a grand jury explicitly files a report saying the jail is completely insufficient for the county's needs. So the town holds a massive convention at the courthouse.
And you would expect, given the grand jury's stark warning, that they would immediately break ground on a new facility.
You would. But after all this debate, what did they decide? They officially declare that building a new jail is inexpedient and unnecessary.
Of course they do.
They cite something called judicious economy, which is just 19th century political speak for we don't want to spend the money.
Classic.
Their grand jury appeasing solution was to just hire some masons to raise the existing stone wall along West King Street by 4 feet. Boom. Problem solved.
It is a textbook stopgap measure. I mean, they are trying to solve a systemic infrastructure problem with a minor cosmetic adjustment.
Which never works.
No, stopgaps always fail eventually. You can raise a wall 4 feet, but if the building inside is crumbling and overflowing, you haven't solved the core crisis.
And shocker, it failed. By 1849, the commissioners and the grand jury could no longer hide behind judicious economy. They finally agreed that they needed a massive, dedicated, state-of-the-art facility.
So they purchased a large tract of land near the city reservoir on East King Street.
They paid $300 an acre to a local man named John Dutchman. Plus, they bought up a few adjacent parcels to get the footprint they needed. And this right here is where the massive architectural pivot happens.
Yes, because they don't just hire a local builder, they hire John Haviland.
And John Haviland is a crucial figure in this story, isn't it?
Absolutely. He was a highly famous architect based in Philadelphia, and he was effectively the premier prison designer in the United States at the time.
He had designed the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which revolutionized prison architecture globally.
Exactly. When Lancaster signed a $102,000 contract with Haviland, they weren't just buying a building, they were buying a specific ideology.
I really want to talk about the physical reality of this building because Haviland did not mess around. He didn't build a municipal office building with some bars on the windows. He built an imposing cinematic fortress.
Oh, it's a monolith.
He utilized this incredibly striking red Cocalico sandstone, which was quarried locally from the Königmacher quarry over in Ephrata. Just the sheer logistics of moving that much heavy sandstone by horse-drawn wagons in the mid-1800s is staggering.
And the scale of the design was intentionally overwhelming. I mean, the front facade of the structure was 200 feet long.
Imagine walking down the street and seeing a solid 200-foot wall of red stone.
Right, and it featured 2 massive 50-foot circular towers right in the center, framing the main entrance.
And then on the extreme outer corners, it had 2 more octagonal towers. And originally, sitting right in the middle of the whole complex, there was this insane 110-foot tall polygonal tower.
Yeah, that 110-foot tower is a fascinating piece of Victorian engineering because it wasn't just decorative, it served as a giant air shaft.
Okay, I have to stop you there because when I read giant air shaft in the sources, my mind immediately went to modern age VAC systems, which obviously didn't exist in 1851.
Right, no electricity.
So how does a 110-foot medieval-looking tower actually ventilate a massive prison?
Well, it relies on the principle of thermal buoyancy, or what engineers call the stack effect.
Right.
In the 19th century, there was a prevalent medical theory called the miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air or foul smells.
And prisons notoriously smelled horrific due to poor sanitation and cramped bodies.
Exactly. So Haviland designed the central tower to act like a massive chimney. The idea was that the foul, warm air inside the cell blocks would naturally rise up and be drawn out through the top of this 110-foot tower.
Oh, I see.
As that warm air escaped out the top, it would create a vacuum effect that pulled fresh, cooler air in through the lower windows and vents of the prison.
Wow. So it's basically a giant passive lung for the building, powered entirely by hot air rising.
That's a great way to put it. It was a highly ambitious attempt at modern sanitation wrapped in medieval stonework.
Did it work?
Well, unfortunately, no. The thermal drafting didn't work nearly as well as Haviland hoped, and that massive tower was eventually dismantled in 1886 because it became structurally unsound.
Ah, that's a shame.
But it speaks to the ambition of the project. I mean, this facility even had its own self-sustaining gasworks.
Another thing I need to explain, because again, 1851, I'm picturing gas stations. What does it mean for a prison to have a self-sustaining gasworks?
This refers to coal gasification. Before electricity, if you wanted bright, reliable lighting, you used gas lamps.
Right.
But you couldn't just pipe it in from a municipal grid like today. Many towns didn't have that infrastructure yet. So the Lancaster prison literally had its own industrial plant on site.
Just right there on the grounds.
Yep. They would take raw coal, heat it to extreme temperatures in an anaerobic oven, meaning an oven with no oxygen, so the coal wouldn't catch fire.
It would bake.
Exactly. It bakes, and as it bakes, it releases a highly flammable gas. They would capture that gas, pipe it through the prison, and burn it for illumination.
That is wild.
It was incredibly advanced for a county jail, but also incredibly dangerous. I mean, you had a literal explosive manufacturing plant operating within the walls of a secure lockup.
Yeah. What could go wrong? So they finished this massive, irregular, hexagon-shaped compound in 1851. It spans 500 feet across. It has 80 individual cells spread over 2 stories, expressly designed to hold a maximum of 160 prisoners.
And as we mentioned, the style was highly specific.
Right. Haviland modeled the Lancaster prison directly on an 18th century castle located in Lancashire, England. And this brings us to the core psychological purpose of 19th century prison architecture.
Right, because if we connect this to the bigger picture, the commissioners didn't have to make it look like a medieval fortress.
Exactly. So where my Game of Thrones analogy comes in. They could have built a giant red brick cube. It would have been cheaper, probably easier to construct. But they chose to spend the equivalent of millions of dollars to build an architectural flex.
I think your analogy is actually quite apt, but we need to understand who that flex was directed at.
It wasn't the prisoners.
No, it wasn't primarily directed at the inmates. Once an inmate is inside a cell, they don't care what the front of the building looks like.
That's true.
The terrifying castellated Norman facade, the towers, the heavy iron grates, the sheer imposing mass of that red sandstone was a visual deterrent directed squarely at the public outside the walls.
So put yourself in the shoes of a citizen of Lancaster in the 1850s. You're living in a world that is just starting to industrialize. Most buildings are maybe 2-3 stories high, made of wood or simple brick. And then you walk past this 200-foot-long, 18-inch thick sandstone wall with 50-foot guard towers. The sheer scale of it was designed to make you feel tiny.
It was a monument to state power. It was physical propaganda. It communicated to every single person who walked past. The state is permanent. The state is impenetrable. If you break the law, you will be swallowed by this fortress and you will not come out.
And for some people, that was terrifyingly literal. Because the castle didn't just hold people, it ended them.
Yes, it did.
If we look at the history of executions in Pennsylvania, before 1834, there were public spectacles. They usually took place out at a place called Gallows Hill.
Right. Crowds would gather. It was almost a macabre festival atmosphere.
But in 1834, Pennsylvania actually became the first U.S. state to outlaw public executions.
Which was seen as a progressive reform at the time. The public spectacles were deemed barbaric and believed to incite further violence rather than deter it.
But the state still had the death penalty. So instead of hanging people on a hill, they moved the gallows inside the prison walls. They kept conducting hangings inside the Lancaster Castle courtyard all the way until 1912.
And the end of that era was punctuated by a mechanical failure that was truly gruesome. And it highlights the physical, visceral reality of what happened inside those walls.
Yeah, this part is rough.
It is. On May 23rd, 1912, the county was scheduled to execute a man named Antonio Romezzo.
The sources on this are incredibly grim. They bring Romezzo out to the gallows in the courtyard, they secure the noose, They pull the lever, the trapdoor opens.
And the rope completely snaps.
Rumenso falls through the trapdoor and hits the ground below alive.
The mechanics of hanging require precise calculations of weight and drop distance to ensure the neck breaks instantly. A snapped rope means a total catastrophic failure of that system.
The prison officials are in total shock. They scramble to contain the situation. They have to pull Rumenso up, find a new rope, completely re-rig the gallows structure, and essentially force him through the psychological torture of the execution process a second time.
It's awful.
They hanged him again nearly 20 minutes later.
And the sheer horror of that event, the mechanical failure and the undeniable cruelty of the botched attempt, was heavily publicized. It directly contributed to the political momentum in Pennsylvania to move away from hanging entirely.
Which happened pretty quickly after that, right?
Yes, the very next year, the state adopted the electric chair as the standard method of execution, centralizing it at the state penitentiary level and effectively ending the era of county-level hangings at Lancaster.
Okay, so we have established exactly what this building is. It is a fortress. It has 18-inch stone walls. It projects absolute unyielding power. It looks, to the naked eye, to be completely impenetrable.
Right.
But here is the thing about fortresses. A fortress is only as strong as the human beings guarding it.
That is always the weak link.
Exactly. So to understand how our first 12 men managed to beat this castle in 1883, we have to meet the brilliant, ruthless outlaws who figured out its weak points. We need to talk about the Buzzard Gang.
And you cannot understand the Buzzard Gang without first understanding the very specific geography and sociology of the region that produced them, the Welsh Mountains.
The Welsh Mountains are a geological ridge that sits south of New Holland, stretching down toward the Chester County border. And we need to be clear, this wasn't just a physical mountain range.
No, it was an incredibly rugged, isolated world of its own. It had a deep, dark reputation.
The local Lancaster newspapers back in the 19th century would literally publish warnings advising merchants and travelers against going through the mountains, calling it a lawless, crime-ridden area.
Yeah.
But the sociology of it is fascinating because it was this incredible early melting pot.
Exactly. Because of its rugged terrain and relative isolation for generations, the Welsh Mountains served as a refuge for people who either didn't fit into or were actively fleeing from the society below.
Right.
It started with the displaced Native Americans and then came poor European settlers, primarily from Wales, which is how it got its name.
But it evolved over time.
It did. By the 1800s, because of Pennsylvania's proximity to the Mason-Dixon line, the Welsh Mountains became a crucial sanctuary for escaped enslaved people who had made it north but needed a place to hide out of reach of slave catchers.
Wow, so it was a real sanctuary.
Yes, and over decades, it grew into an incredibly diverse, tightly knit community of white, black, and later Hispanic families living together. And they were living together in a way that was completely unseen in the rigidly segregated, affluent farming towns down in the valleys.
But the defining characteristic of life in the Welsh Mountains at this time was deep, grinding, systemic poverty.
It was a very hard life.
We were talking about people living in ramshackle, hand-built shacks. They had no running water. They had to rely on natural mountain springs. The soil was rocky and poor for farming. And it's into this harsh, unforgiving environment that the Buzzard family story begins.
The patriarch of the family was a man named John Buzzard. Like many men from poor rural areas, he enlisted to fight in the Civil War, but he never came back.
Right. He died of disease in a military camp in 1862.
Which leaves his widow, Mary Ann Buzzard, completely alone to raise their 8 children, 6 boys and 2 girls, in the middle of this impoverished mountain community.
The desperation of that situation is just palpable. When you look at the court records, the very first member of the Buzzard family to actually enter the criminal justice system wasn't one of the notorious sons who would later rob safes.
No, it was the mother, Mary Ann.
Right. She was working as a domestic helper for a local, wealthier man. And she was arrested and prosecuted for stealing apple butter, a few sausages, and some lard.
Looking at the context of a widow with 8 starving children in an isolated cabin, it is almost certain she was simply trying to keep her family alive.
But the justice system was unforgiving. She was sentenced to 6 months in prison for stealing food.
It sets up this incredibly tragic trajectory for the family. Because their mother is incarcerated, the state intervenes. The Buzzard children are taken and sent to soldiers' orphan schools in nearby towns like Paradise and Mount Joy.
And these were austere, heavily disciplined institutions.
Yes, and the Buzzard kids absolutely hated it. They kept running away. They would escape the orphanages and constantly hike back up into the familiar territory of the Welsh Mountains.
And eventually those 6 boys, Martin, John, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph turned to a life of organized crime to survive.
And they became extraordinarily proficient at it.
They did.
Yeah.
And I have to pause here to bring up a major historical pet peeve of mine.
Mm-hmm.
It's something I see all the time when looking at modern historical society write-ups about the Buzzard Gang.
Let's hear it.
So if you read articles today, there is this weird tendency to romanticize them. Writers dismiss them as these hapless, goofy, petty criminals. People constantly refer to them as just chicken thieves.
I've seen that too, yeah.
And yes, fine, they absolutely stole chickens. But completely ignoring the rest of their criminal resume is insane. It flattens the history. These were violent, hardened, heavily armed outlaws.
I completely agree, but I think I understand why that historical softening happens. The chicken thief label sticks because they operated in an agrarian society, and stealing livestock was a significant economic crime at the time.
That's fair.
However, to your point, we must look at the escalation. They did not stay chicken thieves. By the 1870s, Abe and Ike Buzzard were the undisputed leaders of a gang that numbered roughly 20 men. They had moved far beyond poultry.
They were hitting railroad stations, ironworks, and massive general stores. They were cracking iron safes.
Though, to be totally fair to the hapless narrative, they weren't always great at the safe-cracking part. We have to talk about the 1880 Oxford heist because it's hilarious.
Oh, the 50-cent heist.
Yes. Abe and Ike break into a large coal and lumberyard office in Oxford, Pennsylvania. They find this heavy iron safe. They spend who knows how long sweating, using tools, prying, and cracking this thing open, expecting a massive commercial payday.
And what happens?
The door swings open, and they walk away with exactly 50 cents.
Which is a crushing blow to an outlaw's pride. And what did they do immediately afterward?
They were so mad they walked directly down the street, smashed their way into a local jewelry store, and ransacked the place, stealing over 30 solid silver and gold watches just to ensure the night was profitable.
It really demonstrates their brazenness. But what truly made them a nightmare for local law enforcement wasn't just what they stole, it was how they evaded capture.
Right. They utilized the rugged terrain of the Welsh Mountains like highly trained guerrilla fighters.
They had a legendary hideout known locally as the Blue Rocks. And if you're picturing a simple cave, think bigger. The Blue Rocks was a massive, chaotic labyrinth of giant boulders spanning 100 yards wide.
And the geological composition of the rock was such that when the sunlight hit it, it gave off a distinct bluish tint.
And hidden deep within that boulder field, according to local lore and later accounts from Abe Buzzard himself, was a secret subterranean cave.
They had engineered a system where they could physically pull a large boulder over the entrance to completely camouflage it from the outside.
Abe actually bragged that they could sit up on those rocks, completely safe from the sheriffs and the posses thrashing around in the woods below, and literally look down miles into the valley and see the new electric streetlights of Lancaster City twinkling in the distance.
They used the high ground and their intimate knowledge of the geography to render traditional law enforcement entirely ineffective.
But when evasion failed, they did not surrender. They fought. And this goes directly to your point about pushing back against the chicken thief myth. We have to look at the sheer violence they were willing to employ when cornered.
Exactly. We cannot call these guys just petty thieves when you look at the raw data of the 2 Mile Lincoln gunfight.
That event in 1883 is a critical turning point. It perfectly illustrates the lethal threat they posed to the community.
So here is how it goes down. In 1883, Abe Buzzard and a gang accomplice named John Clifford break into a massive general store owned by a man named A.B. Hollinger in the village of Lincoln.
And they absolutely clean the place out. They steal cash, dry goods, everything, worth thousands of dollars.
Right. And the next morning, Hollinger arrives, sees his livelihood destroyed, and he is furious. He doesn't just call the sheriff. He forms his own heavily armed citizen posse and starts tracking the wagon ruts.
He tracks them to a nearby field where Abe and Clifford are resting. Now, standard outlaw mythology suggests the criminals throw up their hands or try to sneak away.
But not Abe Buzzard. When Hollinger yells for them to halt, Abe immediately pulls his heavy black powder revolver and opens fire directly at the posse.
This initiates a staggering, cinematic 2-mile running gun battle. Picture this. They're sprinting through farm fields, diving behind trees, scrambling over stone walls.
Yeah, they're firing these heavy revolvers, taking cover to reload loose powder and lead balls while on the run, and exchanging constant heavy gunfire with an entire posse of angry armed citizens.
And Abe, it turns out, is an incredibly proficient marksman under extreme pressure. He is lethal.
Yes.
As they are running toward the cover of the Ephrata Mountains, Clifford, The accomplice takes a bullet to the leg and goes down hard in the dirt. He yells out to Abe that he's finished, he can't run.
Now, Abe is also wounded at this point. He's taken a graze. But instead of just abandoning his partner and fleeing, Abe stops.
He turns back toward the pursuing posse. He takes a braced, careful stance and fires 6 deliberate aimed shots into the crowd of men chasing them.
He is laying down, covering fire.
He hits a posse member named Ellis Bard right in the face. The heavy lead bullet goes right through Bard's mouth, shattering and knocking out his teeth, and then fragments hit him in the chest and arm.
It's a devastating injury.
And while the horrified posse stops their pursuit to tend to Bard, who is bleeding profusely in the field, Abe vanishes into the tree line of the mountains.
Now, hearing that level of violence and tactical capability, it raises a very important historical question.
Yeah, why aren't they more famous?
Exactly. If they were this violent and this notorious, Abe Buzzard literally had a $5,000 bounty on his head at one point, which was an astronomical sum in the 1880s, enough to buy a large farm. Why didn't their legacy endure on the national stage?
Why aren't we talking about the Buzzard Gang in the same breath as Jesse James or Billy the Kid?
I believe it's because they fell into a frustrating historical gray area that doesn't translate well into dime novels or Hollywood movies.
I mean.
Think about the archetypal Wild West outlaw. They rob moving trains, they hold up big city banks, and crucially, they accumulate a high body count. The Buzzards never robbed a train. There are no confirmed records of them successfully taking down a major bank.
And the body count.
That's the biggest factor. Despite engaging in massive shootouts, despite shooting Ellis Bard in the face, despite Martin Buzzard shooting an 85-year-old farmer named Isaiah Schaefer in the head during a brutal home invasion, miraculously, none of their victims actually died.
It's credible luck, really. For the victims, obviously, but also for the Buzzards, because it kept them off the gallows.
Exactly. Furthermore, they lacked the focused, dramatic ambition of a Jesse James. Even at the height of their infamy, when they had a $5,000 bounty on their heads, they would intersperse these massive, violent shootouts with stealing a neighbor's horse, or yes, stealing a flock of chickens from a local barn.
They mixed high-stakes organized crime with desperate, petty poverty crime.
Right. They didn't fit the neat, romanticized narrative of the noble outlaw. They were brutal, but they were intensely, messily local.
Local, but incredibly cunning. And that brings us to the moment where the unstoppable outlaws finally meet the supposedly impenetrable fortress. Because in 1882, the law finally catches up.
Abe and Ike Buzzard are cornered and arrested on the main street of Ephrata. They are tried, convicted, and sentenced to a lengthy 13 years.
They are brought to Lancaster, marched through the front gates, and locked inside the Haviland Castle. The state finally has them. The 18-inch sandstone walls have them trapped.
Or so the prison officials confidently believed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Buzzards, sitting in this cold medieval fortress, realize something profound. They look at the 18-inch stone walls, the heavy iron bars, the massive locks, and they realize, we don't need to break the stone. We don't need to smuggle in explosives or spend 10 years digging a tunnel with a spoon. We don't have to fight the architecture at all. We just need to manipulate human nature.
And their manipulation relies entirely on a convergence of specific events. The date is October 10th, 1883. And the cultural context of this specific night in Lancaster is everything.
What was happening?
Down in the city, there is a massive sporting event happening. A heavyweight boxing match between John L. Sullivan, who is a national superstar, the famous Boston Strong Boy, and Herbert Maori Slade. It is the social event of the year.
It's basically the Super Bowl of 1883 for this town. Anyone wants to be there, or at least be at the taverns listening to the updates.
Exactly, and that includes the prison warden, a man named Burkholder, and almost the entirety of the prison staff. They all take the night off to go follow the fight.
So the castle, this massive facility built to hold 160 dangerous men, is left in the hands of exactly 2 night watchmen, Amos Lutz and Edward Sample. 2 guys.
Which is the first critical systemic failure. Severe understaffing. The architectural strength of the 18-inch sandstone walls is immediately neutralized by a gross administrative failure. You can have the strongest walls on earth, but if no one is walking the corridors, those walls are useless.
The second failure is even more fascinating because it stems from human empathy and complacency. Inside the prison, Ike Buzzard and his younger brother Joe are sharing cell 31, which is located on the lower tier of the block.
And directly across the corridor is cell 11, holding their older, highly dangerous brother, Abe.
Now, during his time in prison, Ike had played a very smart long game. He'd been a model inmate. He gained the guards' trust. He had actually taken up a prison job making cigars in his cell, earned some money, and the guards allowed him to use that money to outfit his cell with nice carpets and pictures on the wall.
He cultivated the persona of a reformed, docile prisoner. And because of that persona, the guards permitted him to pursue a highly unusual hobby.
What was it?
They allowed Ike Buzzard to breed canary birds right there in cell 31.
Which sounds incredibly charming. It sounds like a heartwarming story of rehabilitation. But it was actually the foundation of a highly sophisticated biological communication network.
This is where the sheer ingenuity of the plan shines. We have to explain the biology behind the Trojan canary.
Please do, because when I first read this, I couldn't understand how a bird helps you break out of a maximum security prison.
So Ike Buzzard, having spent time breeding these birds, understood a fundamental mechanism of avian biology. He observed the intense maternal instinct of the canary.
Okay.
If you take a mother canary and separate her from her newly hatched chicks, and she hears those chicks making distress chirps, her biological imperative is overwhelming. She will fly directly, immediately to the source of that sound to reunite with her offspring.
So Ike weaponizes this biological imperative. He takes a baby bird from the nest in his cell, he puts it in a small cage, and he politely convinces a guard to take the cage across the hall to his brother Abe in cell 11, perhaps claiming he ran out of room.
And the guard, not thinking anything of it, obliges.
Now, the trap is set. Ike has the mother bird in cell 31, and Abe has the chirping baby bird in cell 11.
Right. And whenever Ike needed to coordinate the escape plan, he would write a tiny note on a scrap of paper detailing timing and tactics. He would carefully tie that note around the mother bird's neck.
And then he just opens his hands. The mother bird hears the baby chirping across the hall. She flies straight out from between the bars of Ike's cell, zips directly across the open corridor, and flies right through the bars of Abe's cell to get to her baby.
She delivers the message with pinpoint accuracy, completely bypassing the guards.
Abe reads the note, writes his reply. One source says his final message was, "All right, do it quick and write no more," ties it back on the bird, and sends her back.
It is a flawless, undetectable, zero-technology communication system.
It's a Trojan canary. So the coordination is complete. The plan is set in stone. The time is roughly 7.3 d.m. Remember, there are only 2 guards in the entire facility. Guard number 1, Edward Sample, decides this quiet evening is the perfect time to get a haircut. And he doesn't wait until his shift is over to go to a barber in town. He walks into cell 30, sits down in a chair, and allows a convicted inmate named Billy Weeder to start cutting his hair.
The level of complacency here is almost difficult to comprehend. You have a sworn guard entrusted with the security of a fortress, voluntarily placing himself in a highly vulnerable physical position, sitting down, draped in a cloth, scissors near his head, inside an inmate's cell while entirely distracted.
It's negligent to the point of comedy, but it leaves guard Amos Lutz all alone patrolling the main corridor. And this is when Ike Buzzard makes his move.
What does he do?
Ike calls Lutz over to the bars of cell 31. He hands Lutz a bird cage and says, "Hey, Amos, can you do me a favor? Can you take this cage over to Abe? It's bigger, it gives the bird more light, and just bring his old, smaller cage back." Lutz, being a nice, accommodating guy, says sure.
And here is the fatal mechanical error. Lutz takes the cage and walks across the corridor. Crucially, because he fully intends to turn right around and come back with the other cage in 10 seconds, he does not lock Ike's heavy cell door behind him.
Lutz walks the few yards over to cell 11. He puts his master key in the lock, turns it, swings Abe's heavy door open, and steps into the doorway to hand over the bird. He leaves the key dangling right there in the lock.
And that's when it happens.
In that exact split second, Ike Buzzard springs out of his unlocked cell like a coiled spring. With 2 massive athletic jumps, he clears the width of the corridor. He hits Lutz squarely from behind with his full body weight, shoves the guard face first into Abe's cell, grabs the heavy iron door, slams it shut, and turns the master key.
In a matter of perhaps 3 seconds, without firing a shot, without wielding a single weapon, the Buzzards have captured half the guard force and secured the master keys to the entire fortress.
It's a flawless tactical strike. Ike and Abe don't pause to celebrate. They immediately sprint next door to cell 30. Guard Sample is sitting in the chair, literally mid-haircut, probably listening to the boxing match results through an open window, when suddenly the heavy iron door of cell 30 slams violently shut and the lock clicks.
Both guards are now trapped inside the cells they were supposed to be guarding.
What's fascinating to analyze here is the immediate pivot the buzzards make from stealth and manipulation to absolute chaos and control.
Exactly. Once the guards are neutralized, they don't just quietly slip out the back door and disappear into the night. They initiate a full-scale, aggressive takeover of the cell block corridor.
Ike takes the master keys and starts running down the line, turning locks. He throws open the doors of 10 other long-term, highly desperate convicts.
We're talking about hardened men, convicted arsonists, violent burglars, and a guy who was practically a legend in his own right, the notorious John Frankfurt.
Right. Frankfurt was a one-eyed horse thief who was already famous in the region for pulling off prior jailbreaks. Frankfurt steps out of his cell and immediately takes point. He runs to the kitchen area, grabs a massive butcher knife, and starts sprinting up and down the corridor.
He is screaming, threatening any of the remaining prisoners in their cells who even thinks about making a sound or yelling for the police outside.
They establish absolute authoritarian control over the interior space. Then the gang swarms what was formerly Cell 9.
Right. Cell 9 had been converted by the warden into a makeshift storage room and armory. The inmates completely strip it. They find the guards' personal winter overcoats and slouch hats, and they put them on to disguise themselves for the escape.
They grab more butcher knives. They find a double-barreled shotgun and ammunition. And in a brilliant, remarkably modern tactical touch for 1883, they locate the prison's newly installed telephone box.
They rip the box open and slice the wires, completely severing the castle's only modern lifeline to the city police department down the street.
They are now heavily armed, disguised as authority figures, and in total, undisputed control of a severed fortress.
They march in a group to the back gate facing Orange Street. They use the stolen master keys to unlock the massive iron gate, and they step out into the cool October night.
But the escape does not happen without a tragic, violent encounter in the yard. As they are crossing the open space toward freedom, they are confronted by Bruno.
Bruno was the prison keeper's massive, loyal bloodhound.
And Bruno was doing exactly what he was trained his whole life to do, defending the perimeter of the prison. He charges the group of escaping men. But these inmates are armed, their adrenaline is peaking, and they are absolutely desperate not to go back in those cells.
They rip the heavy, solid wood legs off a nearby cigar-making table, and they brutally beat the dog to clear their path. Bruno survived the initial savage attack, but he succumbed to his internal injuries and died 2 weeks later.
A sobering, ugly reminder of the raw violence underlying this supposedly clever escape.
It grounds the story in reality. This wasn't a victimless prank. It was a desperate, violent breakout by dangerous men.
They push past the dog, slip through the gate, and lock the exterior gate behind them, taking the master keys with them into the night, so pursuit is delayed even further. But amidst all this action, the adrenaline, the violence, there is one detail that I find so incredibly funny it almost feels scripted. Remember Joe Buzzard?
The younger brother.
Yes, the younger brother who shared cell 31 with Ike. Joe helped plan the whole thing. He was the one who actually bred the canaries and cared for the birds. He was integral to the plot. But when Ike hits the guard, throws the cell doors open and yells, "Let's go, we own the place," Joe politely declines.
It is a brilliant, cold, rational calculation in a moment of extreme chaos.
He literally sits on his cot, looks at the open door and says, "Nah, I'm good." Because Joe knew his specific legal situation. His sentence for a minor burglary near Ephrata was almost completely up. He had maybe a few weeks left.
He realized that the risk of joining a massive armed breakout, triggering a statewide manhunt, and potentially getting shot or adding 20 years to his sentence if recaptured simply wasn't worth it.
So he just sat in his cell listening to his canaries sing, while his brothers and 10 other men vanished into Lancaster moonlight.
It shows a level of discipline you rarely see in these situations. The fallout from this event, as you can imagine, was politically explosive.
Oh, I bet.
The local newspaper the next day, the Daily Intelligencer, published a scathing front-page editorial titled "Palpable Negligence," and they hit the nail squarely on the head. They didn't blame the architecture.
What did they blame?
They wrote that the county had spent a fortune building this elaborate, intimidating institution with iron-cased cells and massive walls, but had fundamentally compromised it by providing it with stupid jailers, meaning the prisoners essentially kept the prison.
Wow.
The grand 1851 architecture was entirely nullified by human empathy and horrific staffing policies.
The manhunt that night was pure chaos, largely because the gang had cut the phone lines, delaying the alarm. Some of the gang split off and were spotted later that night walking down a dark, dirt road near the village of Earlville. A group of local farmers saw these guys walking at 11 p.m. and shouted out, asking who they were.
The convicts, wearing stolen coats, didn't panic. They smoothly called back, "Oh, don't worry, we're just a baseball 9 and we missed our train back to the city."
A remarkably quick-witted, culturally relevant alibi that perfectly deflected suspicion. Baseball was booming in popularity, so a traveling team made perfect sense.
Eventually, the law did catch up. Ike was captured relatively soon after. It took years for Abe, but eventually, tired of running and freezing in the mountains, he just walked in and turned himself in to avoid being shot by bounty hunters.
But you look at this entire story, a 12-man mass escape, orchestrated with a pet bird, an unlocked door, and a mid-shift haircut, and you think to yourself, okay, the county learned this lesson. It was a massive public embarrassment. They will never, ever let something like this happen again.
You'd think that.
The operational protocols inside that castle will be ironclad for the rest of time.
Which brings us to a concept that penal historians and sociologists know all too well. Institutional amnesia.
Institutional amnesia.
Yes, prisons, as bureaucratic entities, are remarkably bad at remembering their own vulnerabilities as generations of staff turn over, wardens retire, and budgets fluctuate.
Right. Because if we fast forward exactly 88 years, we arrive at the night of June 29th, 1971. The world has completely changed. The horse and buggy are gone. John L. Sullivan is a distant memory. We are in the modern era of state police helicopters, advanced multi-channel radios, and modern forensics.
But inside the Lancaster County Prison, the conditions are eerily, terrifyingly identical to 1883.
The structural parallels are striking. In 1883, the vulnerability was a massive cultural event, a boxing match that distracted the staff and stripped the prison of its manpower. In 1971, the vulnerability is internal, a massive multi-million-dollar modernization and construction project that has the entire facility in a state of chaotic, noisy, dust-choked disarray.
Imagine the atmosphere. There are contractors everywhere. Temporary walls are up. Scaffolding is leaning against the stone. There's the constant sound of drilling and hammering during the day. It is an environment ripe for exploitation.
And the understaffing. It hasn't been solved in a century. On the night of June 29, 1971, it's evening visitation hours. There are 160 prisoners housed in the facility. Do you know how many guards were assigned to watch them that night? 4.
4 guards for 160 men, a ratio of 1 to 40.
And it's actually worse than that.
Mm-hmm.
Because one guard has to man the secure front gate and one guard has to manage the civilian visitors in the visiting room. That leaves exactly 2 guards to actively monitor the cell blocks. 2 guards. Just like Amos Lutz and Edward Sample in 1883.
And just like in 1883, despite all the 20th century upgrades, the Grand Escape hinges on a single, mundane, inexcusable human error, an unlocked door.
A guard simply forgets to lock a door to a shower room on the cell block. That's it. That is the crack in the armor that brings the fortress down. And what happens next is basically a classic Hollywood heist movie. It's Ocean's 11 meets Escape from Alcatraz, mixed with some extreme parkour.
The inmates immediately recognize and seize the opportunity. A group of them slip unnoticed into the unlocked shower room. Now, these rooms have high barred windows for ventilation. The inmates climb up, balancing precariously on a hot radiator to reach the window, and they produce a smuggled hacksaw.
Where did they get a hacksaw?
Well, Warden Kenneth Cliff later speculated to the press that due to the construction chaos, someone on the outside might have simply walked up and thrown a hacksaw over the low construction wall into the yard where an inmate pocketed it.
Regardless of how they got it, they have it. And I really want to focus on the mechanics of this, because sawing through a 34-inch solid steel bar with a hand hacksaw is not like in the cartoons. It takes hours. It is physically exhausting. Your arms burn.
And crucially, it is loud. Steel grating on steel makes a high-pitched screech. To do this while guards are theoretically patrolling requires incredible coordination. They had to time their sawing with the ambient noise of the prison, stopping whenever they heard footsteps.
And their goal wasn't even to remove the entire window. They only managed to saw through one section of the bar, bending it back just enough to create an opening.
And what an opening it was. They don't create a massive, comfortable hole. They create a gap that is exactly 14 inches wide and 2.5 feet high.
To put that in perspective, the average adult male shoulder width is about 16 to 18 inches. To get through a 14-inch gap, a grown man has to completely exhale to compress his rib cage, turn his shoulders at a severe diagonal, and essentially dislocate his natural posture to scrape his way through the steel.
It is an act of sheer claustrophobic desperation. But 12 men managed to squeeze through this tiny opening. They scrape through, drop 10 feet down into the dark, and land in a section of the prison's exercise yard.
And here is where the chaos of the modernization project becomes their greatest tactical asset. A secure prison yard is supposed to be a barren, empty space with zero cover and zero objects that could be used as tools.
But because they are building new additions, the yard is a cluttered mess of building materials.
The inmates look around and find a massive, long piece of heavy construction timber. And there's an incredibly ironic twist here. The prison officials knew this timber was lying around, and they were worried inmates might use it to climb during daytime recess. So the guards had proactively taken that exact piece of timber, nailed thick coils of sharp barbed wire to it, and laid it horizontally across the top of a newly built lower interior wall as a makeshift deterrent.
The intention was to make the wood too painful to handle. The inmates simply ignored the pain. They picked up the heavy timber, barbed wire and all, gripping it through the barbs, and repurposed the prison's own deterrent against it.
They physically carry this heavy, spiked log and prop it against the newly constructed interior wall at an angle. They use it as a ramp. One by one, 12 men scurry up this barbed wire log in the dark. Now they're standing on top of the new interior wall, but they are still trapped inside the complex.
They still have to beat Haviland's original, towering 1851 red sandstone perimeter wall, which looms much higher than the new construction.
So they improvise a bridge. They carefully walk along the narrow precipice of the new wall until it physically intersects with the old stone wall.
But the old wall is still a full 10 feet above them, so standing on a narrow ledge in the dark, they form a human pyramid. They physically boost each other up, straining and lifting, until the first man can grab the top of the original fortress wall and pull himself up.
He then pulls the next guy, and the next, until all 12 men are standing on the very top of the original 1851 fortress walls.
It is an astonishing physical feat. From there, they have to traverse the perimeter. They walk along the sheer drop, silhouetted against the Lancaster night sky, making their way toward the southeast guard tower near Franklin Street.
And once again, they used the construction project against the prison. The workers had left heavy industrial strips of burlap lying around the tower, likely for curing concrete or moving materials. The inmates gather the burlap, tie the strips together into a makeshift rope, drape it over the rough, abrasive sandstone ledge to protect their hands, and one by one, they lower themselves down the sheer face of the castle to the street below.
12 men. Exactly the same number as the Buzzard escape 88 years prior.
But this escape did not happen with the same fluid success. It extracted a severe physical toll. One of the escaping inmates was a 22-year-old man named Robert V. Boyer, who was serving time for burglary.
As he was making the final desperate descent down the burlap rope, he lost his grip and slipped. He plunged the remaining distance to the hard asphalt of the street below, and the impact resulted in a brutal, catastrophic compound fracture of his right leg. The bone broke through the skin.
He is lying in the street in absolute agony. His fellow escapees, knowing he can't run, manage to drag him away into the shadows to hide him temporarily before they scatter.
But his injury is far too severe for street medicine.
Less than 2 hours later, in a bizarre turn of events, Boyer's own foster mother and his brother actually drive him back to the front gates of the prison. They surrender him directly to the guards so he can be transported to the hospital to save his leg. And here is the kicker. It was only when Boyer was carried bleeding through the front doors at 8:55 p.m. that the 4 guards on duty realized a mass escape had even happened.
The guards were entirely oblivious until an escapee was literally handed back to them. And the discovery of the escape, the sudden alarm, the rallying guards triggered a cascade of chaos inside the cell blocks.
Because the inmates who remained inside the lock blocks realized exactly what was happening. They saw the guards panicking, they realized the staff was entirely overwhelmed, and they erupted.
It was a spontaneous, massive, diversionary riot.
The prisoners started smashing everything they could get their hands on. They were yelling, screaming, throwing debris. They refused orders to lock into their cells, just milling aggressively around the blocks. They even managed to ignite a small fire, filling the corridors with acrid smoke.
Warden Cliff later stated to the press that this wasn't just mindless violence, it was a deliberate, tactical smokescreen. The inmates were intentionally creating a chaotic, dangerous environment to prevent the understaffed guards from conducting a formal body count and figuring out exactly who was missing.
And this riot, this manufactured chaos, leads directly to the most tragic element of the 1971 escape. We have to talk about Deputy Warden Edward T. Hutton.
Hutton was 64 years old. He was a man who had devoted his entire adult life to the Lancaster County Prison. He started his career there as a low-level guard back in 1942, and he steadily worked his way up through the ranks over 29 years to become the deputy warden. He knew every inch of that stone.
And crucially, He wasn't even on duty that night. He was off the clock, relaxing at his home on Edgewood Avenue.
But like many dedicated law enforcement officers of that era, he kept a personal police scanner radio running in his house. Suddenly, he hears the frantic, panicked dispatch calls screaming over the radio about a mass escape and a riot at the prison.
He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't say, "I'm off the clock." He jumps in his car and rushes straight to the prison to help his men regain control. He runs through the front gates, past the chaos, and straight into the business office. The air is thick with smoke, alarms are blaring, men are screaming.
He picks up the phone, trying to urgently call the warden at home to brief him on the disaster.
But the stress of the event, combined with the extreme physical exertion of rushing into a riot situation at 64 years old, was simply too much for his heart to bear.
While he is on the phone, talking to the administrative assistant, a man named Warren Stork, Hutton suddenly collapses. Stork is on the other end of the line, and he realizes Hutton has gone silent but hasn't hung up the receiver.
Stork immediately radios an aide to run to the business office and check on him. The aide bursts in and finds the deputy warden lying unresponsive on the floor. They frantically load him into the back of a police cruiser, sirens wailing, and rush him to Lancaster General Hospital, but it is too late.
Edward T. Hutton was pronounced dead of a massive heart attack upon arrival.
It casts a deeply somber, profound shadow over the entire spectacle. While 12 men were utilizing parkour and hacksaws to run for the river, a man who gave 29 years of his life to maintaining that facility died trying to hold it together. It removes any romanticism from the event.
The manhunt that followed over the next few days was intense and highly modernized. Unlike 1883, the police didn't have to rely on asking farmers on dirt roads. State police helicopters aggressively buzzed over the city, shining spotlights, tracking freight trains leaving the rail yards. Heavily armed posses with tracking dogs scoured the dense, wooded areas along the Conestoga Creek.
And their persistence paid off a few days later, culminating in a raid that feels almost surreal.
They tracked 4 of the escapees to Shad Island, which is a small, overgrown island sitting right in the middle of the Susquehanna River, the police boat out there, and discovered that these guys haven't just been hiding under a bush.
In a matter of days, they had built a fully camouflaged wooden shack hidden deep in the undergrowth, and they had stocked it. They had a stash of food, battery-powered radios to listen to the police scanners, candles, and a large quantity of illicit drugs. It was like they had set up a criminal summer camp in the middle of a massive manhunt. The police actually had to deploy tear gas canisters into the heavy brush just to flush them out of the shack and take them back into custody.
When you take a step back and look at 1883 and 1971 side by side, the central architectural fallacy of the Lancaster prison becomes glaringly, almost painfully obvious. John Haviland, brilliant as he was, designed a castle meant to project an aura of absolute, unbreakable control. But in both of these extreme instances, the architecture itself was rendered completely moot by severe operational negligence. An unlocked shower door, a distracted guard getting a haircut, a forgotten hacksaw.
Wait, I need to stop you there and push back on this a little bit.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for the concept of prison design? Because if we look at this history, we build these terrifying stone monuments, we spend millions of dollars to project absolute control, but it feels like at a certain point the architecture is just a theater set. It's a stage play for the public, while the inmates are just exploiting the stagehands. Is the architecture totally meaningless?
I wouldn't say it's meaningless, but I would argue that its meaning has an expiration date. In 1851, those walls were a very real, very terrifying physical barrier to the average person. But you have to remember that prisons are not static monuments. They're living, breathing ecosystems. As the decades pass, technology evolves, inmate ingenuity evolves, but the stone remains exactly the same.
By the time we get to the late 20th century, the Lancaster Castle had entirely outlived its architectural epoch. It became a theater set because the modern methods of security cameras, electronic doors, secure tool management couldn't be properly integrated into a 19th century shell.
And that living ecosystem concept is proven by what happens next. Because if we look at the broader legacy of Lancaster Prison, especially moving into the later half of the 20th century, guys aren't even acting like it's a castle anymore. They're treating it like a slightly inconvenient, poorly managed hotel.
You're referring to what penal historians often quietly categorize as the improvisational eras of the prison's history.
Oh, yes. I have categorized them myself. Let's review the methods of the time, as a local newspaper so delicately put it when summarizing the chaos. First, you have what I call the ladder era.
A truly baffling failure of basic inventory management.
In 1968, an inmate named Andrew Mayberry decides he wants to leave. Does he use a canary? No. Does he saw through steel? No. He simply walks over to the prison maintenance shop. Because he was granted trustee status, meaning he was trusted to do chores, he literally just picks up a ladder, carries it across the yard, leans it against the wall, and climbs out.
3 years later, in 1971, 2 guys on a painting detail are in the yard. They find a 20-foot wooden ladder that construction workers had just carelessly left leaning against a building. They say thanks, climb up, and walk away. In 1974, 2 more inmates take an aluminum extension ladder from the shop and scale the Marshall Street wall in broad daylight. They literally just used ladders.
What this reveals is a total systemic breakdown in tool control. In a modern functioning prison, every single tool, especially something as inherently dangerous to security as a ladder or a hacksaw, is cataloged, locked on a shadow board, and signed out with a physical chit. If a tool is missing at the end of a shift, the entire facility goes on lockdown until it is found. The latter era demonstrates an administration that was severely underfunded, poorly trained, and dangerously complacent.
And when the administration finally locked up the ladders, the inmates just pivoted to textile engineering. Enter the bedsheet era.
A classic trope, but one that requires immense patience and skill to execute successfully.
In 1964, a guy who was serving heavy time for actively shooting at police officers manages to cut his cell lock. He climbs up through an interior skylight, gets onto the roof, and successfully scales down the massive exterior wall using a rope entirely made of knotted bed clothing. And you'd think, okay, 1964, old times. No. Fast forward to 2013, this is barely a decade ago. An accused serial burglar named Dwayne Weir is acting suspiciously in his cell. The guards search him. They find a 17-foot meticulously braided rope ladder made of torn bedsheets wrapped tightly around his torso under his uniform. And when they toss his cell, they find another 36-foot rope hidden under his mattress.
The resourcefulness of the confined human mind is truly boundless. A bedsheet seems flimsy, but when you understand the tensile strength of twisted cotton and you have nothing but 24 hours a day to test knots and braid fabric, you can manufacture highly effective climbing gear.
But my absolute favorite era, the absolute zenith of the theater set analogy, is what I call the sheer audacity era. Forget ladders, forget bedsheets. In 1993, an inmate named Hubert Michael, who was awaiting trial for horrific crimes, murder and rape, is sitting in his cell. A guard walks up to the door, opens it, and calls out a name. But he doesn't call Michael's name. He calls out the name of Michael's cellmate, who is scheduled to be legally released that very day.
The bureaucratic vulnerability of a manual identity system.
Hubert Michael looks at the guard, just stands up and says, "Yep, that's me." He walks out of the cell. He goes down to the processing desk. He signs the discharge papers with a fake signature. He processes out of the building, and he literally pushes open the heavy front doors of the mighty castle and walks out into the street as a free man. No one checked his signature against a file. No one cross-referenced his face with an ID photo. He simply claimed to be someone else, and the fortress let him out. He was eventually caught days later, hiding out in New Orleans.
When you force a 19th century building, designed for 1849 protocols, to operate in the late 20th century, the architecture itself becomes a massive liability. The thick stone walls obstruct radio signals. The narrow corridors make modern camera placement difficult. The building becomes less about keeping inmates securely inside and more about trapping the justice system itself in archaic, unmanageable conditions that practically invite bureaucratic crisis and physical escape.
And that exact crisis is playing out right now in real time. That beautiful, terrifying 1851 castle was expressly designed to hold a maximum of 160 people in relative isolation. Do you know what the population has looked like in recent years? It has been crammed with over 12,250 inmates. It is bursting at its stone seams.
And the human cost of that severe overcrowding cannot be overstated. We talked about Haviland's 110-foot air shaft that was dismantled. The current facility lacks any cohesive modern ventilation system. It lacks central air conditioning. During the brutal, humid Pennsylvania summer months, the temperatures inside those 18-inch stone walls that absorb and radiate heat become absolutely suffocating. It is a miserable, dangerous environment for both the inmates serving time and the guards working the shifts.
And this modern crisis boiled over very publicly in the summer of 2020. Grassroots activist groups like CRASH, which stands for Collective Resistance Acting in Solidarity for Humanity, and the local Healthcare Right Committee organized major vocal protests outside the Lancaster County Government Center. They were protesting what they explicitly called cruel and unusual conditions inside the prison. And remember the context. This was during the terrifying height of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were demanding immediate action because the cramped, unventilated, physically unsafe conditions inside the aging castle had allowed the virus to spread rapidly, leading to the tragic deaths of 3 inmates. They were literally pointing at the historic facade and saying to the county, this is no longer a functioning prison. It is a deadly hazard.
Which forces the county government to finally face an inevitable, expensive reality. You simply cannot retrofit a medieval castle to meet 21st century humanitarian, medical, and security standards. You cannot wire it properly, you cannot plumb it properly, and you cannot ventilate it. The physical plant is exhausted. The judicious economy of 1831 has finally run its course.
Which is why there are now massive official plans in motion to finally, permanently abandon the Haviland Castle. The county has purchased land and is currently navigating the complex process of building a brand new, sprawling facility outside the city limits. It's projected to open somewhere around 2026 or 2028. After nearly 180 years of escapes, riots, hangings, and overcrowding, the heavy iron grates on East King Street are finally going to close for good.
It will be the definitive end of an architectural era, but it is an absolutely necessary evolution for the safety, security, and basic human dignity of both the inmates housed there and the staff tasked with guarding them.
It is a wild, sweeping story. So to quickly recap our journey today for everyone listening, we started all the way back with a 1729 rough-hewn log cabin sitting in a dusty tavern yard. We watched the ambitious architect John Haviland build an intimidating 18-inch thick red sandstone castle designed to project the ultimate unbreakable power of the state. We watched the cunning Ike Buzzard completely dismantle that illusion of power in 1883 using nothing but a mother canary, a distracted guard, and an unlocked door. And we watched history violently and tragically repeat itself 88 years later in 1971 when a forgotten shower door and some repurposed construction planks allowed 12 more men to vanish into the night, resulting in the heartbreaking death of a deeply devoted deputy warden.
It is a remarkable century-spanning narrative of human fallibility constantly, inevitably undercutting architectural invincibility.
So here's my challenge to you, the listener. The next time you're walking through your own city, I want you to take a real critical look at the imposing historic buildings you pass every single day. Look at the massive stone courthouses, the brick armories, the old columned municipal halls. When you look at those terrifying, invincible facades, ask yourself, what is going on behind the stone? How many of those grand buildings are secretly hiding deeply flawed, outdated, jury-rigged human systems on the inside? How many fortresses are just waiting for a distracted guard to leave a door unlocked?
And I will leave you with one final lingering thought to consider. Fast forward to the year 2028. Lancaster will likely cut the ribbon on its brand new state-of-the-art prison. It will be hailed as a marvel of modern correctional engineering. It will have digital sensors, biometric fingerprint locks, infrared perimeter cameras, and absolutely no 18-inch sandstone walls. Politicians will undoubtedly declare it unbreakable. But 100 years from now, in the year 2128, will the podcast hosts of the future look back at our unbreakable biometric technology with the exact same amused disbelief that we have when looking at an 1883 guard trusting an inmate with a pet canary? Because if the 250-year history of the Lancaster prison teaches us anything, it's that human nature, driven by the desperate, unrelenting desire for freedom, will always eventually find the open window.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.